Before we begin, I should cover a few things. Please note that this meeting is being broadcast via webinar and is being recorded. The meeting recording and materials will be posted on the council's webpage. Only members of the council will be able to unmute themselves to participate in the meeting. When you do unmute yourself, please speak clearly into the microphone and identify yourself when speaking. If anyone has technical issues, you can call the DWR Help Desk, 602-771-8444, or email tickets@azwater.gov. I love the tickets that IT puts out. They're great. I encourage you all to get one someday. So there are some other meeting logistics that Trent is going to go through, and he's also going to call the roll. Then I'll have some more opening remarks.
Hi, everyone. As we've done at the previous committee meetings, I will call roll. Please turn on the microphones in front of you and speak into those at any point today, but also during roll call. If you are online, you should be unmuted now, you should have the ability to unmute. So speak up if you're online, and if you are an alternate for anyone, also please let us know. All right, Patrick Adams.
Present.
Bitta Becker. Paul Brierly. Brenda Berman.
Here.
Cynthia Campbell.
Here.
Maria Dadgar.
Here.
Ron Doba.
Here.
Doug Dunham. Sandy Favorites.
Here.
Kathy Ferris.
Here.
Chairwoman Amelia Flores. Representative Gail Griffin.
Present.
Spencer Camps.
Here.
Jamie Kelly. Senator Sina Kerr.
Grant Hanna, alternate for State Senator Sina Kerr.
John Kamik.
Scott Schladweiler, alternate for John Kamik.
Chris Kuzdas.
Here.
Governor Stephen Lewis. Sharon Megdal. Leslie Myers.
Here.
Chairman Robert Miguel. Joe Olson.
Present.
Haley Paul.
Here.
Karen Peters.
Here.
Sarah Porter. Clark Princell.
Here.
Commissioner Robin Sahit.
Here.
Joe Singleton.
Here.
Stephanie Smallhouse.
Here.
Abe Springer. Craig Sullivan.
Here.
Senator Priya Sundaresan.
Here.
Warren Tenney.
Here.
Tom Torres. Representative Stacey Travers. Chris Udall.
Here.
Sandra Watson. Thank you.
Thanks, Trent. So I want to reinforce the importance and the urgency of the work ahead for the council. We all heard from Governor Hobbs that she wants to see recommendations, whether legislative rules or policy, completed by December of this year. I also want to acknowledge, as we're moving forward here, DWR staff at the table. To my right, Bruce Hallen, Assistant to the Director, Carol Ward, Assistant Director, Nicole Clovis, Chief Counsel, Ryan Mitchell, Chief Hydrologist, and Trent Blumberg, our Council Coordinator. I think we can advance the slide to the next slide for the agenda. So I hear we're having technical difficulties. I will, as they're hopefully being resolved, go through the agenda. The first agenda item is the welcome. That's what we're in right now. And we're going to talk about focus areas and objectives. We're going to have an update on the work of the Assured Water Supply Committee. And then the Rural Groundwater Committee. We'll talk about upcoming meetings and some closing remarks. After we go through an update on the Assured Water Supply Committee, I think that's the proper time to take comment questions and have discussion about where we're at in that process. And then we can move to the Rural Groundwater Committee and do the same thing. And at the end of that slideshow and discussion by staff, we can have, again, discussion, comments, questions, et cetera, from the council members. So we'll turn it over, I think, to the next slide on the council focus area and objectives. And again, we are to review and make recommendations for changes to the Assured Water Supply policies, legislatively, administratively, or by executive action to address the challenges revealed by Assured Water Supply modeling projections while continuing to strengthen the integrity of the Assured Water Supply program, protect consumers and aquifers, and ensure future growth is not reliant on mined groundwater. Again, we need to develop recommendations for a water management framework to assist rural Arizona communities to manage their groundwater resources through the work of the Groundwater Committee. Both of these issues are critical, and we need some paths forward, some solutions now. This is the expediency brought up by the governor when she kicked off this group at the first meeting. The governor wants a suite of recommendations by December, as I mentioned earlier, and so we can now move to a discussion of the Assured Water Supply Committee to date, and I'm going to turn this over to Carol Ward, who will provide an update on the activities of that committee. Carol.
Thank you, Director, and good afternoon, council members. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you for bearing with us as we try to resolve some technical issues. Okay, there we go. So the 1980 Groundwater Management Act and the Assured Water Supply Program in particular have guided responsible growth in an arid environment. They have provided consumer protection, ensured new homes have sustainable water supplies, and positioned Arizona as a leader in water resource management. Commitment to the program from cities, water providers, and developers has made the program what it is today. As the committee works to review the Assured Water Supply Program and make recommendations to the Assured Water Supply policies to address the challenges revealed by the Assured Water Supply modeling projections, we are doing so under a set of critical guiding principles. Thank you. All right, there we go. These principles are worth reviewing. Proposals must protect the strength and integrity of the Assured Water Supply Program. Proposals should enable future growth without reliance on mined groundwater. Proposals may not reduce the 100-year requirement or increase the depth to which groundwater may be pumped. Proposals must ensure there is water before growth, and proposals must protect consumers. So to recap where we are with the Assured Water Supply Committee, we held the first meeting of the Assured Water Supply Committee on June 27th. The issue to be addressed was described, as well as the committee's task, objective, principles, and process. ADWR staff presented several proposal concepts for consideration, ideas for addressing wildcat and build-to-rent development, commingling challenges, and future infrastructure challenges. Committee members offered proposed concepts at the meeting and submitted additional concepts to staff in follow-up to that meeting. A compilation of the concepts was subsequently posted on the ADWR website under the council pages. The July 13th Assured Water Supply Subcommittee meeting was a working meeting. Based on the momentum and interests expressed by members at the first committee meeting and in prior forums, the subcommittee began exploring initial concepts. These included concepts to address the issues of commingling and future infrastructure. After discussion, addressing these two issues independently was put on hold in favor of exploring the concept of an alternative or hybrid path to designation, which would include addressing commingling and future infrastructure. The hybrid designation concept was described broadly at that point and discussed at some length. Doug Dunham offered to work with interested subcommittee members to begin building that concept into a preliminary proposal to bring back to the subcommittee for consideration and discussion. That effort is currently underway. Given the scope and the complexity of the concept being developed into a proposal, it won't be ready for next week's committee meeting, but we hope it will be ready for review within the next few weeks. A second alternative designation concept, referred to as a nested designation, was discussed as a means to address the commingling issue in certain circumstances. Given the narrow applicability of the proposed solution and the potential to otherwise address commingling through other proposed concepts, it was set aside for the time being. The potential to incentivize development on ag land was also discussed. No one immediately volunteered to flesh that idea out further, but it is certainly open for discussion at future meetings. Interest in exploring the potential for retiring grandfathered rights was expressed at that meeting as well. At the August 15th committee meeting, the committee built off the momentum and comments received at prior meetings, continuing to discuss specifically the build-to-rent development issue, wildcat developments, and the potential for retiring grandfathered rights. And I want to remind everyone that all of our meeting materials are available on our website for those looking for more detail about these meetings. So I'll provide the council with a very brief overview of the three topics that were discussed in more depth at the committee's last meeting, starting with build-to-rent and wildcat development. So build-to-rent communities are single-family residential development that does not meet the definition of a subdivision, which would be 6 or more parcels for sale or lease, excluding rentals of 1 year or less. These communities are single-family rentals but fall under the exemption from subdivisions as they are leased for less than 1 year or they are not subdivided into more than 5 lots. In all other aspects, though they look, smell, and taste like a residential subdivision, including having common areas and other exterior water demands. It's important to note that the market has created this unique demand for this particular type of community as another option for renters who do not want to live in traditional multifamily housing or do not want the commitment of home buying. Wildcat development is an informal term to reference the proliferation of development by subdividing land into 6 or more lots with the intent to circumvent laws relating to the creation of a subdivision. And it can mean a lot of different things depending on who you ask. It can also confusingly be applied to legal lot splitting, which is to say splitting a parcel up to 5 times. The real issue here with the Wildcat development is those who are intentionally trying to avoid subdivision laws by acting in concert or otherwise obfuscating their true intent. Next slide. With respect to build-to-rent, the goal is to ensure that build-to-rent communities are under the protections of the Assured Water Supply Program, creating parity between the subdivision across the street and these communities. The concept to address this defines residential lease community by specifying that a residential lease community includes single-family homes without regard to how long the lease term is and how many homes are on a lot. It would bring build-to-rent communities under the Assured Water Supply Program and require CAGRD fees to be paid, if applicable. It would require that a city or county not approve a building permit if certain conditions are not met. Most of these suggested provisions to address build-to-rent were taken from discussions and language surrounding build-to-rent legislation this past legislative session. A lot of progress was made on trying to define these communities and address stakeholder concerns through that process. On Wildcat development, within an AMA, to sell or lease lots within a subdivision, an assured water supply is required. If no subdivision is created, no assured water supply is required. The Department of Real Estate has noted that it is very difficult to address those who are intentionally trying to circumvent laws related to the creation of a subdivision, and they've noted several challenges. I won't go into these in depth, but I will mention them briefly. Acting in concert is vague and difficult to prove. It requires proof of intent. 6 or more lots is the threshold today, but that number has actually varied through the years from 4 to 6. The timing of the violation is problematic. Often developers will have made significant investments before the Department of Real Estate's review is triggered prior to sale or release. Or lease, my apologies. The definition of contiguous limits the scope of acting in concert. For instance, locating a street between lots would render them non-contiguous. So ADWR staff are currently having in-depth conversations with Assured Water Supply Committee members and other subject matter experts as necessary to explore the solutions to addressing these challenges. We expect to bring an initial proposal to the committee at an upcoming meeting. Also at the August meeting, ADWR staff described the department's statutory authority to purchase and retire grandfathered rights. That authority is implemented as a program that may be included in the management plans. It would require a formal modification process to the 5th management plan for each active management area where that program would be implemented. The potential provisions of a program to accomplish this would include the purchase and retirement of the right, not the land, so it would not involve ADWR actually managing property. Any type of grandfathered right or combination of rights could be purchased and retired. Statute allows for the use of withdrawal fees to purchase and retire rights. It does not preclude using other sources of funding, so that could be a possibility. To provide context to the committee, DWR staff provided breakdowns of the types of rights, the volume available of those rights, and the actual volumes used in 2021. Depending on the type of right and the AMA, utilization of these rights may range from 0 to 84%. Whether the volume of water saved is worth the cost and effort to implement the program remains a question for further discussion by the committee. So in summary, these 4 concepts that you see on this slide are actively in development. The alternative or hybrid designation concept is currently being developed into a proposal that will be shared with committee members once it has been built out enough to have detailed discussion. Further discussion of retiring grandfathered rights is needed to assess the value, but there is already a viable mechanism in place to implement it. Proposals to address build-to-rent and Wildcat will be ready to present possibly as early as this month. We are currently focusing on building proposals that have the most potential to be brought to completion by the December 1st deadline. That doesn't mean other concepts can't be discussed and developed as the council and committee continue their work. There is one additional item that we will be discussing in the near term. So as we have said throughout this process, we plan to discuss the modeling questions that have been raised. We wanted to get some momentum behind our initial proposals first. But having achieved that now, we hope to have discussion of the questions about programmatic requirements and assumptions of the modeling at the September 12th Assured Water Supply Committee meeting. This includes items like assumptions regarding the use of effluent to replace groundwater pumping, the ramping up of demand over time, and assumptions regarding Colorado River shortages. Concerns and proposals that are technical in nature, such as pumping relocation, can be addressed by ADWR staff outside the council and committee process at any time. So please do not hesitate to send inquiries and proposals to David McKay, the Assured and Adequate Water Supply Manager. He will coordinate with staff internally to ensure proposed changes are consistent with policy. Chairman Bushatsky, members of the council, this concludes my update for today. Staff and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have at this time.
Thanks, Carol. Before we move forward, I think as we went through the roll call, either we missed some members who are online, or maybe they were like me and their fingers don't work fast enough to unmute themselves in time. So can we go back through any members that are online who didn't get a chance to address the roll call? Can you identify yourselves for us, please?
Sharon Mandel here. We were not elevated to co-host when you went through the roll, but I've been here since the beginning.
I believe I have a list of those we've identified online, so I'll go through the roll call of those members again, and if you are online, just let us know. So Paul Brierly, Kathy Ferris,
I am here.
Amelia Flores, Jamie Kelly,
I am here and we can see him, Chairman Flores.
okay, thank you. We heard from Sharon Megdal, Sarah Porter, Abe Springer, Senator Sundaresan,
I'm here too.
Representative Stacey Travers,
Here.
and Sandra Watson.
Hi, and Chair Buchatsky, this is Bitta Becker. I was also unable to unmute earlier when called.
Welcome all those online. So as
Thank you.
Carol talked about.
Director Bushatsky? I'm sorry, Director Brierly is on, but he can't unmute.
So I want to reinforce something that Carol talked about, and December is not the end of the line for this council. So we have additional time to work on issues. We've talked, I think, in either this group or in committees about other issues that we've not even yet begun to address that are of import to many of you on the council or in the committees. So Carol went through a recap of the assured water supply discussions to date. I'll ask at this time, do members of the council have questions or feedback on Carol's presentation? And of course, we can go back to any slide if we need to as you ask your questions and make your comments. So who wants to lead off? Representative Griffin.
Yes, on the unmet demand that we were going to revisit, I would like to put that on a future agenda to discuss unmet demand.
So I think, as Carol talked about, we're hoping at the September 12th meeting to talk about the model, and that would include that discussion of the unmet demand in terms of how that works in the model and what creates the unmet demand, and show some of the results of what the model's showing for the unmet demand geographically.
Thank you. And for the rural area subcommittee, is there going to be further discussion on the temporary INA that was presented by Senator Kerr?
At this point, we've narrowed down the prospective options for the Rural Groundwater Committee to the LGSA, Local Groundwater Stewardship Area, but we have not, as a committee, sat down and discussed other options in lieu of the LGSA, but we're trying to focus on the LGSA at this point.
Any other members of the council? Warren.
As we're looking at the Assured Water Supply Program, was thinking about that over the last 30 years of that program, and based on the Groundwater Management Act, the premise has been, the principle has been, we want to bring in renewable supplies so that we're not relying solely on groundwater. And so I'm wondering if, as part of the discussion with the modeling, or even at another time, to have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about what are the challenges of developing the new supplies, and also having those new supplies, how do those fit within the current regulatory framework? If we're working to try to change a regulatory framework, it seems that we really need to make sure that we've got the water that we need to have, and that it's not just the water, but the infrastructure and all the costs involved for that. And so I'm wondering if, as a council, we could look at how to bolster the abilities of WIFA, which was reconstituted last year, but we did that with the purpose of trying to develop new supplies. For this purpose that we're trying to make sure that growth continues on renewable supplies. And so that's one option, but also I've heard that there are interests out there that are willing to go and invest in new supplies, but they're hitting roadblocks, they're facing some hurdles in being able to do that in the current regulatory framework. I think it would be helpful if all of us around this table, understood what is the challenges there, so that we can make sure that we are doing all that we can to develop those new water supplies so that they can be put to use and are what we're relying on rather than groundwater. So hopefully that made some sense.
So Warren, we'll think about how we might create a common level of understanding for some of the issues. But I think some of those issues are long-term issues that we're not going to resolve between now and December. And we're still looking to meet the charge of the governor by having some solutions that are workable now under our current framework, regardless of the issues attached to infrastructure, new supplies. The CAP canal, for the purposes of transporting water for Wheeling, is somewhat out of our control, but it's not going to be resolved by December. We know there are issues that folks on the river have, folks that live, work, and have their businesses on the Colorado River who have concerns about their water supplies being moved to central Arizona or southern Arizona. There are opportunities for infrastructure through WIFA and through various federal funding pots to maybe find some infrastructure projects that can help us in this regard. But I don't want to lose the focus on trying to come up with solutions we can implement very quickly before we have time to work through all those issues. And again, a common understanding is probably good. Maybe the council addressing those issues in further detail is something for the continuance of the council past December. Doug.
Thank you, Tom. We've discussed some of these specific items within our subcommittees, or that we've had meetings here recently. I think there are some of the things that Warren touched on that are programmatic, that can be addressed. I think some of it we've already touched on already, like commingling, some of those others that are some of the impediments that are out there. I don't know. Warren has discussed a large suite of issues that I think we all understand are out there. Better understanding that would be good, but I think there's some items in that we can definitely get through before December. So.
Spencer.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of touch on what Warren and Doug said. I think there's some value to maybe looking at this. I understand the time frame, and I think that does limit a lot of conversations, but it's probably a worthy discussion if we can have it in the short amount of time. The other thing I wanted to mention was the TDAWs, as I call it, the transitional designation issue, and I know Warren's done a lot of hard work on it. The reality is that whatever DAWS concept we consider and ultimately adopt really doesn't work unless it moves Buckeye and Queen Creek to a designation. And I think there are two stakeholders that haven't been consulted enough as it relates to us developing this concept, and we need to include them in some manner in a deeper conversation to understand what their challenges. Both those communities are very unique in a lot of ways in terms of their water supplies and their land uses and how they've grown or not grown. And so just getting a better understanding of those unique challenges from them to make sure this concept works for them, I think is a worthy conversation in some form, or offline or online. And, because at the end of the day, the outcome of them not being able to use this product is we're going to have unreplenished groundwater use. And I don't think that's a goal of anybody on the committee. So we need to make sure that tool works.
So Spencer, that's a point well taken. I believe some working on TDOTs may have had some conversations with those two entities as well. I know that DWR had some conversations with those entities as well. One of the challenges right now that I think we're facing is TDOTs is still being developed, and so it's hard to get final kind of feedback from Buckeye and Queen Creek, but I think it's an iterative process, and as TDOTs gets more meat on the bones, that will have opportunity to talk to them as well to get their feedback, because I agree with you. If those two entities can't use whatever we come up with, that's problematic. I think we hope to create something that they can use and it will be up to them to decide whether or not they want to use it, which is a different issue. Others?
I would just echo what Spencer said. I know that we've had internal discussions and are supportive of them having some skin in the game.
Anyone else? Representative Griffin.
Yeah, just one final comment that I had, and I brought maps. Anybody that comes in my office gets copies of these maps, so maybe you can scan them, but I'll pass them around. What is in white is all the property we have in Arizona in private hands. Everything else is either tribal land, military, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, or state trust lands. So we're limited in the state as to how we can grow. And I think that's an important issue. I think there was a comment made at one of the meetings saying that some people would like to build on every acre or every inch. We're limited to 13% of Arizona that's in private hands, and some of that is in nonprofits, churches, synagogues, and such. So I think we need to take into consideration the ability to grow and where we can grow because of that issue. And if I didn't make enough copies, maybe you could scan it and send it out.
We will definitely post it
Thank you.
on our website with all the materials from this meeting.
Thank you.
So I'm able to see folks in the room who are on the council. I'm not so good maybe at seeing people either raising their hand, members that are online. Do we have any comments or questions from council members online?
So they just, I don't know if we had anybody that they just need to unmute themselves.
Reminding those online, if you do want to speak, you can unmute yourself to do that now and ask your question or raise your comment. I don't know, I've seen some of the names of the people online. I can't believe that they all don't want to say something, but. So hearing none, are there others around the table that wish to make a comment or ask questions? Ron.
Thanks, Tom. I have to admit I've been focusing my time mostly on the Rural Groundwater Committee, and I'm really glad to see that the Assured Water Supply Committee is looking at these wildcat lot splits issue. But I don't know if, is there anybody, the Prescott AMA, it's probably a bigger problem there than anywhere else. Is there anybody from the Prescott AMA that have been involved in these discussions with the wildcat lot split issues? Carol, you may know better than anybody. Or do I need to go to that one too?
Maybe you need to go to that one too. In terms of the committee and subcommittee, no, but I'm not sure if the stakeholder group that's developing the proposal has been talking to anyone in that area.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I can't figure out how to raise my hand, sorry.
Yeah, don't hesitate to jump in.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to say thank you for summarizing the discussions that we've had in the Assured Water Supply Committee. I think it's really promising that we have a number of proposals that we will continue to flesh out, and the four that you listed, I think, are of great interest, certainly to me, to continue discussion and getting more details on there. So I want to thank you all, especially at DWR, for the work on this, and I'll be in touch with additional ideas by our next meeting.
And so I think I recognize your voice. I want to make sure for the records that was Senator Sundaration, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Tom, this is Sharon Metel. I just want to make a comment. I think this issue of defining wildcat subdivisions, which was pointed out by Carol, is quite difficult. And I'm wondering, have there been any actual wildcat subdivisions noted, defined? Because I've thought over time, the problem is that these situations develop, and whether it's acting in concert or whatever, I just want to know, I see that as a challenge to ever figure out ahead of time. And we know we have some situations where they grow over time, and I'm hesitant to ask, so I'm not going to ask about a particular one that's been in the news.
We lost you, Sharon.
Oh, sorry.
Mid-sentence.
I'm sorry, I don't know, I'm not showing it, but anyway, I think this wildcat development designation ahead of time is going to be very difficult. I don't know where that's going to go.
Yes. So I think what Sharon was getting at is that she believes it's difficult for the Department of Real Estate to identify these circumstances early enough, and that is one of the difficulties that they're having because of the challenges that have been identified, is getting ahead of this and keeping it from happening and being able to enforce it. It is my understanding from what we heard from the Department of Real Estate that they have seen instances of this. It's just been very difficult to actually bring them into compliance. And you know, Ben, I don't know if you'd add anything.
Yeah, that's correct. I know DRE has taken enforcement on a couple of these issues over the last several years, but it is difficult for them to prove, and that's why you're seeing them identify all these challenges. And hopefully we have some ideas to bring to the committee soon.
And we did have a real estate department person at the committee. They did a slide presentation. That slide presentation is available on our website if folks want to look at that in more detail.
And they are working with DWR staff and members of the subcommittee to develop a proposal to bring forward to address these issues. They do feel that it is something that can be managed. We just need to address it. Hopefully, Sharon, that answered your question.
Yes, it does. It did. Thank you.
Any other members of the council around the table or on the virtual platform want to comment or ask questions? I am not hearing or seeing anything, so we could probably go to the next slide and move on to a report regarding the Rural Groundwater Committee. And I'm going to ask Bruce Hallen to provide that committee update.
Thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. There have been 4 meetings of the Rural Groundwater Group, 2 committee meetings and 2 subcommittee meetings. And thank you to the committee members for attending those meetings. For today's update, in a very similar fashion to the Assured Water Supply Committee update, to the council, I will first go over the Rural Groundwater Committee focus and the goals and objectives of the committee. These items are stressed at each meeting of the committee or subcommittee meeting so that we remain focused on addressing the specific problem of groundwater overdraft in rural areas of the state, developing recommended solutions that address the problem, and meeting the governor's expectations for the committee. The Rural Groundwater Committee focus, these are really the realities. Outside the active management areas and irrigation non-expansion areas, there is limited regulatory framework for managing groundwater. There is no requirement for metering and reporting from non-exempt wells, with the exception of community water systems. Many communities are facing aquifer depletion with limited access to renewable water supplies and no tools to manage the groundwater declines. And there are increasing calls for a framework that will assist rural communities to manage their groundwater resources. And I can tell you, since I've been in this position at DWR, we get a few inquiries or calls each month from people that are having issues associated with groundwater in some of these rural areas, whether it's drying wells or dropping water tables. Next slide, please. The Rural Groundwater Committee goals and objectives by December 2023 develop policy, legislative, or other actionable recommendations for the governor that provide a groundwater management framework that assists rural communities to manage local groundwater resources, protect water users, and sustainably manage aquifers. These recommendations will assist the rural communities outside the state's AMAs or active management areas and the INAs, the irrigation non-expansion areas, in managing local groundwater resources and mitigating further aquifer depletion. And these recommendations should be broad enough to apply to any groundwater basin's management needs and customizable to be tailored to a basin's unique characteristics. So I think it's important they're broad, they're customizable, and with local input and recognizing the basin's unique characteristics, each of these basins' unique characteristics. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the group has met 4 times, 2 committee meetings and 2 subcommittee meetings. At the first June 29th committee meeting, we provided a high-level review of use, number, and location of wells in a few select groundwater basins, the Wallapai, Wilcox, and Douglas basins, to provide some context on the groundwater situation and the problem that we need to address, the unique nature of each basin, and the need for a customizable approach that fits the local solution, the local situation. We also presented a matrix comparing the groundwater management tools on other concepts that have been proposed. You have groundwater conservation areas, rural management areas, and local groundwater stewardship areas. And then we also talked about and compared active management areas and irrigation non-expansion areas. And as you look through the management schemes in each one of these concepts, it revealed that there's a significant amount of similarity on the proposed management schemes between each of these concepts. So with that, we provided a starting point and a proposal and asked for input from the committee on the proposal and asked them to suggest management schemes needed to address the problem, in which past concept they may support. We formed a working subcommittee to delve into the details of the concept. So at the first subcommittee meeting on July 11th, the meeting members discussed various concepts and actions needed to move forward. It became apparent that we needed more information and more data on the situation as it related to potential priority groundwater basins, what basins are in immediate need of assistance. We also discussed statewide measuring and monitoring. What is a good groundwater management framework? What are there immediate mitigation options that we could move forward with on these priority areas? And then is there an opportunity here where we can begin evaluating a process for more of the regulatory overlays? And then lastly, of course, discussion on infrastructure. Next slide, please. We took the feedback from the July meeting. At the August 9th subcommittee meeting, DWR came back with a more detail regarding groundwater conditions across the state's basins. We will be presenting that information to you today. The data highlights where the priority areas exist. We also took input from the past 2 meetings and began formulating an approach. The preferred approach, building upon the local groundwater stewardship area concept, incorporated many of the issues and schemes mentioned by the committee members. It also meets many of the objectives of the committee. A broad focus, supports individual basin needs, is somewhat customizable, significant local end user input and involvement and a focus with their involvement and a focus on managing aquifer conditions with oversight, direction, and approval by the Department of Water Resources. The August 17th committee meeting was an overview of the subcommittee work, and we began delving into the details of building upon the LGSA framework, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But before I provide more overview on the specific items the committee will be focusing upon as recommended actions to the governor, we would like to present to the council an overview of the groundwater situation across the state by basin. Ryan Mitchell, ADWR's chief hydrologist, will be presenting this information. So Ryan.
Thank you, Bruce. Appreciate it. I'll be showing some slides that we presented in the Rural Groundwater Committee and subcommittee meetings. They are a way of assimilating a lot of groundwater data into an easier to understand format. So we do have some infographics for you guys, some visualizations of data. Trent, you want to hit? Before we get into the plots and the maps that we're going to show, I do want to caveat what we're going to look at by saying the following plots are not all of our wells. This right here is a map that shows all of our index wells. So these are not all the wells within the state. This is not all of the registered wells across the entire state. These are the ones that our hydrology staff go out and regularly monitor. So our personnel, our staff will go out either annually, quarterly, monthly, depending on where these wells are located. They'll collect water level measurements, they'll double check the use, and if there's a flow rate, they'll associate that to it too. Anything and everything that they measure and collect gets posted to the groundwater site inventory, GWSI database. That database is accessed by multiple folks in this room and their associated organizations, but that database itself is available as a web app on our webpage too. So if you're ever curious to see what the water level trends have been in your area or in areas across the state, I encourage you to follow that link and poke around and see what you can find. Any of those dots there that you select will show you any and all water level measurements that we've collected, regardless of the period of record. We have over 1,700 wells across the state that we monitor regularly as part of our index line. 135 are equipped with transducers, so they're automatic data loggers that record the water level. Out of those 135 with transducers, 80 of them report that data through telemetry every day back to our data sets, the database. The rest we actually go out and hand download periodically. And as I said at the beginning, also all that data is available, it's publicly available, and anyone can access and poke around. Trent? So there was a request for data for the basins across the state, and essentially, how can we distill that huge number of wells and all of those data or all those water level measurements that we collect? How can we distill it into a digestible format? So we're going to be looking at a clip of some data. So like I said, it's not going to be every one of those wells. We'll be showing you wells that have a 20-year period of record where we've been collecting measurements from them, and that they were published in our open file report number 20, which was released this last April. So we took the OFR 20 report, we took one of the tables, and it's referenced here, table 6, and it is a statistical count of all of the wells within each of those basins, and it's reporting whether or not over the 20-year period those wells had a rise in water level, a decline in water level, or if it stayed static or the same. And so using those data, we were able to generate what are called box and whisker plots. So Trent? Box and whisker diagrams or plots are extremely helpful in, digesting a significant amount of data in just a single graphic. So to explain what we're looking at here, Trent, want to click one more time for me? The box you see in the center, the rectangle, is going to represent the inner quartile range of all of the data. So this is a statistical method for looking at large data sets. And the way to think of it, or the best way to think of it, is if you were to line up all of the data points and put them into numerical order, and we're not worrying about what the values actually are, we just want to line them all up in order. 25%, 25%, 25, you separate them into quarters. The upper quartile is that upper section where there's a whisker, so a line and a top maximum plus the whisker line. That will represent, the length of that represents how many data points are in there. So if you see, or what the range is of those data points. So when you see the plots coming up, if that whisker is really long, that means you've got data points that spread that whole range. The interquartile range, which is the middle two quartiles that you see in the rectangle, that is the same thing. So 25% of the data points fit in that range. And then the lower quartile is the bottom 25%. The white line that you'll see in the middle of each box is where the median is. So if you lined up all that data and cut it in half, that middle point, where does that fall? That's where, so that you can differentiate the second and third quartiles in that middle rectangle. And the X that you'll see is the average. So that's based on the actual decline rates or rise rates, so the numerical values. So every basin that we are going to look at will have a box and whisker plot. They'll be compared side by side, and each subsequent map that we look at will be at the same scale. And so that is done so that you can directly compare visually across all of the basins. You'll occasionally see, but not all the time, you'll see dots above or below the box and whisker plot, and those are outlier values. And a data point statistically is considered an outlier if it exceeds 1.5 the interquartile range. So if it is very far away from the rest of the data set, statistically, it gets flagged as an outlier. But we still show them and represent them. We don't get rid of them. And with that, we'll jump into a few of the maps. So instead of showing all 51 basins on a single plot, it'd be hard to see and hard to read. This is separated out into planning areas just for ease of consumption. The Central Highlands here, you can see each basin has a letter associated with it. And on the bottom, you can tell which basin that is. So A, B, C, D. Also of note, if you look at these box and whisker plots, below the plot and above the name, you'll see an N equals value. And so the N value or the N count is actually the number of data points that were from that data set. This is important or significant because if the N value is sufficiently low, like 1 or 2, then more data would be required to make an educated decision on how to manage that basin. But if we have multiple data points, like on the Verde River Basin, there's 21 different data points that we use, different wells, and that gives you a broader sense of the basin itself. And just as a reminder, it is not all of our wells. It is only the wells within that publication that had that 20-year period of record so that they can all be compared apples to apples. All right, next. Here we see the lower Colorado River section planning area, and of note, you can see on B, Gila Bend Basin, we have a significant amount of drawdown over the last 20 years. All of those wells show drawdown, and the volume or the scale of it is quite large. It gets up to almost a couple hundred feet for some of the wells. And so remember the whisker length on the bottom, that represents 25% of all the data points. So you don't want to look at just the interior box and say that's where most of the data is. That's just where 50% of it is. That bottom whisker is still 25% of all of the data points. Harquahala there shows a wide range of decline. Lower Gila Basin is relatively stable. McMullen shows a decline with some outliers in there. And the other thing to note too, sorry I didn't mention it on the first map, but anywhere you see kind of a pink blob on those basins, that's where we have known, mapped, measured land subsidence features. And land subsidence features are significant because they are indicative of overpumping or overmining the aquifer. If you dewater fine-grained sediment, it will compact and inelastically compact, and it shows itself at the surface as a drop in land elevation. Some of these are in terms of inches, and some of these are in tens of feet. So land subsidence is non-trivial. Next. Here we're looking at the southeastern Arizona basins. Aravaipa and Wilcox show a significant amount of decline. The Wilcox one, you can see that the data range is extending further down. The volume of data in that bottom whisker is more. There's also outliers that drop even further. You'll notice that there is no plot here for Douglas. That's because Douglas is an AMA. It's on a different slide now. But this is showing in the southeastern part of the state what those basins look like. It also gives you a snapshot of how many points of data we have that cover that 20-year period. And there are definitely areas where we would like to have better coverage, more information, more data. so that we can flush out maps like this and make intelligent decisions. Next. Upper Colorado River planning area. We see some areas here with predominantly rises, but in your eye might be drawn to them. But the next thing you should do is take a peek at the N count. And so if you see an N count of 1, just know that more data is required to make any assessment in those areas. You can also see on this geographic area that Wallapai Valley is showing decline. Now, this is a 20-year period of record, and the majority of that decline has occurred in the last 5 to 10 years. So even though the period is longer, their decline really ramped up recently. Next. And here is a plot of all of the active management areas in the state. With the exception of Douglas and somewhat with Prescott, we have much larger data sets. These areas have been managed for decades. And what I think is interesting or fascinating about this plot is that it's showing these managed basins are staying relatively stable and also showing 20-year rises in most of the area. So this, if nothing else, is an indicator of how critical it is for us to manage resources. And next. So here are what we have coined the priority basins. These are basins that are not AMAs or INAs, but are in need of management of some kind. Gila Bend Basin, you can see a significant amount of decline. There's also land subsidence occurring. Renegris Plains is also showing a lot of decline and land subsidence that's been increasing over the recent years. And then the Wilcox Basin, which has a very large subsidence feature across the basin, and the data from this set show all declines over 20 years. And next slide. That's it for me. I don't know if you want questions now or later. It's up to the others. We'll do them at the end.
Thank you, Ryan. And thank you for the very interesting hydrological study that you presented there. Very much appreciate that. Through Ryan's presentation, I think it's obvious which basins in our state require action and attention to ensure we protect rural economies while sustainably managing the sole source groundwater supplies that these areas are reliant upon for their livelihoods. The Rural Groundwater Committee has honed the framework, as I mentioned, to focus into 2 areas. I talked about the local groundwater stewardship area type approach, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail, and also honing in on measuring and reporting. Next slide, please. So why LGSA? And why building on the local groundwater stewardship area? Well, it isn't new. There's a lot of familiarity with it. There's some past draft legislation that we can work on. There's been a lot of input on the design from a wide variety of rural stakeholders, water users, and other officials. It's a flexible approach to accommodate the local situational issues and unique characteristics, which is very important with each basin. Local water user oversight, planning, and involvement. ADWR management, approval, and support. It can provide a focus on priority basins, those basins where there's overpumping occurring today, declines in aquifer levels, or physical signs of distress. And it's an alternative, flexible approach to AMA or INA that also focuses upon managing the aquifer. Next slide. So there's a lot of work that we're going to be doing here in the next month or two on essentially focusing in on developing a better understanding of the details on the components of the LGSA. We started this process asking committee members to first analyze and provide feedback on the initiation and creation of the LGSA, and also on the issue of council membership. And for them to be prepared to discuss these issues and this information at our next meeting. Other areas of discussion that we're going to be working on, as you can see on this slide, are council duties. What are the goals? Potential goals for the LGSA? LGSA plan, what does that plan look like? and sunset or review provisions associated with the LGSA in and of itself. ADWR's role will also need to be discussed with the committee in more detail, but the agency will have oversight on the creation, implementation, enforcement, and legality of the actions being proposed by the LGSA. Next slide, please. Measuring reporting, this was another area that we're going to have some focus associated with getting an understanding on progress associated with any type of regulatory framework that we initiate. Next slide. We discussed a variety of options and potential approaches to ensure progress toward any groundwater management goals. Anytime you have any groundwater management goals, measuring, monitoring, reporting of groundwater use will be critical. You simply cannot manage without some form of measurement to understand what's happening in an aquifer. The group discussed mandatory or voluntary metering and reporting, where the requirements and whether the requirements should be statewide versus targeting areas and what requirements need to be in place. We have not worked out all the details on a recommendation. However, there are a few requirements that need to be in place for managing groundwater. Non-exempt wells would be metered, in particular those areas where a regulatory structure is in place, annual reporting. We talked about quarterly as being something that wasn't too onerous for end users, and to provide ease in self-reporting through either online forms or some sort of postcard. We plan to have many more detailed measuring and reporting recommendations to the committee in a future meeting. I was hoping at our next meeting, but I don't think it's going to happen at our next meeting. We're looking at some other concepts, so it may be at a meeting sometime in October. Next slide. So what are the next steps for the Rural Groundwater Committee? Our next meeting is September 14th and at 10 a.m. Committee members need to review components of the LGSA that we just talked about and be prepared to discuss details, provide suggested revisions and additions, and members need to review and discuss the LGSA proposal with their constituents and colleagues in order to provide feedback at the next meeting. With that, that concludes my update associated with the Rural Groundwater Committee. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Ryan. Again, as we have discussions or questions and feedback, we can go back to any slide that you all would like to go back to. So again, members of the council, I'll remind you, hopefully identify yourself when you speak. So any members of the council want to add, subtract, have questions? Stephanie.
Yeah, Stephanie Smallhouse. I guess I'm totally surprised at Bruce's comment that the committee has decided that the focus is going to be the LGSA. I don't recall ever deciding that in a committee setting, especially because we have been asked as a committee members for proposals and feedback on what we've discussed. And I know that there have been proposals and items given for discussion. So I guess I'm surprised that that decision has been made, because I don't recall that being a conversation of the committee, especially because the LGSA is, to date, is a failed concept. And so are we limiting ourselves to discussion of a failed concept, or are we going to continue discussing ideas that we feel like will work? I know for sure that with the LGSA, the largest beneficial water user in the state was not included in any of that drafting or development. So I think that's been one of the failures of the concept. But I think that a lot of the committee members have certainly have ideas to contribute, but I don't know that those are necessarily within the confines of the LGSA. And some of what's been presented to us along the lines of the LGSA doesn't even match what's in the LGSA. It's actually more restrictive. So I guess I'm surprised and confused.
Perhaps I wasn't as accurate in my description. We're using the LGSA as a framework in order to build maybe a hybrid approach that essentially includes many of the elements associated with the LGSA, but we're definitely interested in your feedback and input on what pieces of the LGSA work and what pieces of the LGSA you don't think will work. But there are many elements of the LGSA that we think meet a wide variety of the needs for these rural groundwater basins. Local input, customizable. And so while I have mentioned LGSA, I would highly suggest you all look at the legislation, see what pieces make sense, what pieces don't, and come to the next meeting so that we can have that discussion in those areas. So it's going to be more of a hybrid of the LGSA.
Chris is next.
So I think you just answered my question. We're being asked to look at legislation as it's currently drafted, as it was filed, or?
Yeah, if you can look at the most recent draft, just use that as kind of an outline or a framework, but go ahead, Nicole.
Well, I think you can certainly reference the actual legislation that was introduced and discussed at the legislature. I think, though, that what we're proposing for discussion is what was described in the department's PowerPoint presentation at the last meeting, at the last committee meeting. And you can, suggest changes to those components, or, identify components that you like, that you don't like, that you think should be changed. And some of those may differ from the legislation at the legislature. But I think our framework for discussion is the most recent PowerPoint.
Yeah, if you recall, we identified slide by slide, the relationship between what we were proposing and some of the LGSA proposals. So take a look at the last meeting presentation.
Grant, I think you had your hand up next, and then I think I saw Stephanie's hand raised again.
Thank you. Grant Hanna here for Senator Kerr. I agree with Stephanie's comments that is a surprise. I will say what you said, Bruce, is accurate, that we have not discussed the senator's TINA bill. It was submitted through the framework of the process for submitting comments, and right now the council's approach has been, we have a starting point and we'll go down this starting point. I think the senator is disappointed that a proposal from legislative majority is not being discussed as a reasonable option that requires a legislative solution. I think when the senator built that, it was taking into account the population, the regulated community that Stephanie is referring to, the folks that would actually be subject to additional regulation and powers that are granted. We talked in the last meeting a little bit about even though it's a local framework, the inability of the locality to actually control the layer of government if they choose that this is not right for them. So the senator asked me to convey, is there going to be a step in the timeline where we will receive feedback from the regulated community that would be subject to whatever framework is recommended by the council?
I guess I'll look to the director, but from my perspective, I'm looking to the committee members to go out and reach out to the regulated community and to share some of these concepts and to share the focus of where we're headed and get their feedback and bring their feedback to these meetings.
So, Grant, I think that if any legislative package that appears in front of the legislature is going to have opportunity in that process for whoever wants to weigh in, whatever stakeholder wants to weigh in, and just go back to the basic goal of what we're trying to do here in this committee with some new regulatory overlay. It's trying to create something other than an active management area, other than an irrigation non-expansion area, which in various venues we've heard from various stakeholders maybe doesn't quite work as well as they would like it to work to address the local conditions. But again, absent something new that can get enough support to find a way to get implemented. We still have the active management area and INA tools out there for the director, or in some cases for the public themselves to decide they want. I think Stephanie was next, then Representative Griffin.
So I think there's definitely items within the proposal, the legislative proposal, that are workable for the agricultural community. So I guess we're just waiting to see those reflected in what we're discussing in the committee. And to date, that hasn't been reflected. So again, I'm just wondering when that will be reflected so that we can say, you know, that may not be in the LGSA right now, but that is something that we think is a positive solution, and we want it incorporated into our discussion. So, and it doesn't seem like that's happened today.
Well, and Stephanie, if you can bring those items to us that you think are workable, you know, please do at our next committee meeting.
Representative Griffin.
I had a question on the types of wells that Ryan went over. Are they identified as user, you know, are they ag, are they industrial, are they municipality, commercial?
The vast majority of the wells that were on the plots are the wells that are on the big map.
On the map?
The wells that are on the big map are all of our index wells, and all of them are going to be non-pumping monitor wells. We don't want to monitor or take a water level from a well that's too close to one that's pumping, because then you'll get a pumping level and not a static water level. The well use can be correlated back to its 55 number. So if the well is in an area that has to register and tell you if it's ag, industrial, municipal, an active management area, you can get a lot of data. The 55 numbers are on there, so when you click on them on that map, it will tell you what's the registration number, who's the owner, where is it. It'll give you all the data that we have on all the wells.
Is that the 135 or 1,700 that you identified?
1,700. That's the total, all of them.
Do you have them condensed as to category?
They could be sorted that way. It would be a lot of data, but yeah, you can export this as a CSV or a data or access database and then sort it by type.
Okay. Local, thank you. I heard local input, but not local approval. And the old plan that we're talking about, if you use groundwater for drinking water, that qualifies to be in the program. And the only repeal is if you're not using groundwater for drinking water, so it'll never be repealed if we're using groundwater for drinking water. There's a lot of problems with that bill. And so this will not just affect, this is a statewide plan. This will not just affect a certain area. This is everything outside of those areas that have Colorado River water. So that's 12 of the 15 counties. And I heard a lot of screams referencing that bill previously. So, thank you.
Chris, then Spencer.
Yeah, so I think it's worth pointing out right now, and I think the director, you did this a little bit too, to deal with these challenges in our rural basins that we hear more and more about. There are we currently have 3 options: new AMA, new INA, or nothing. And over the last several years, more and more rural communities have been coming to the legislature saying these 3 options are not good enough for us. We need more tools, more options to deal with our local groundwater challenges. Those proposals have not gone anywhere at the legislature, and so we're still here with either new AMAs, new INAs, or nothing. So in response to all these challenges last summer, about 24 rural community leaders got together, started working on the proposal that became the LGSA proposal, and introduced that in legislation. So I want to point out that there was a lot of rural communities that got behind that concept, started working it at the legislature. And certainly, Stephanie, if there are elements the Farm Bureau is interested in and elements the Farm Bureau doesn't like, we should definitely talk more about that. But I think it's also worth distinguishing the TINA concept, the temporary INA concept. That concept was introduced in legislation last year. Really, really difficult, only applies to agriculture, so only targeting one sector. And then the initiation process for that, more difficult to achieve than a permanent INA, so it's really not a workable concept. I do think that's different, though, from what Senator Kerr submitted in her comments that have broader values and broader principles that may be worth considering. So I think just distinguishing the temporary INA with what Senator Kerr submitted is worthwhile too.
I feel like I'm missing out on a lot in the rural groundwater meeting. So it's kind of a bookkeeping thing. I'm not on the rural groundwater committee, but I'm a member of the council. And I don't get any emails about what's going on the rural side. Is there a possibility for the council members, or just me, to be put on the email list for both subcommittees, just so not that we need to attend, but just keep up to speed on all the discussions? Is that a reasonable request?
So, Spencer, one option, at least at the committee level, those meetings can be viewed. And then we have posting of everything on our website. So I think there's another option for you to at least watching through the website and the postings we make in great detail. We put up every slide, et cetera, on that. So I hope that will meet your request rather than, I mean, we could send you an email and say, hey, Spencer, now it's up on the website, but I don't know how much that helps you or anybody, because it's up shortly after we have the committee meetings and the schedules are available on our website.
Okay, and that's fine. But I have, since you mentioned the website, I have submitted comments some time ago, and I haven't seen them posted on the website. So is there a link that I'm not getting, or page I'm not seeing, or is there a reason that our comments aren't posted? For the Assured Water Supply Committee.
Spencer, thank you for bringing that to my attention. I was not aware. Please, council members, committee members, if you notice that something's not on the website that you would have expected to be there, please let me know. We have reset the website since the last council, and it may still need a little bit of adjustment to make sure that things are showing up. So, Spencer, again, thank you. And if there's anything else, please do let us know. Normally, we do post things within a day or two of the meeting or receiving them.
Sandy and then Representative Griffin.
For the framework, some of the angst and some of the concerns that we hear or that we express, I think the big thing for users in the rural area, particularly those who have been in the rural areas for a long time, the existing users, is that any framework developed is not aimed at removing them or getting them out of the way. The framework has to recognize existing water users, or I would hope that any framework would recognize the existence of existing water users and their role in those communities historically. Beyond that, when you're looking at the goal for these rural areas, the difficulty in developing a goal when you're developing a program like this is, it says that it's going to be based on the characteristics of that area or of the conditions of that area, but isn't the basic goal for these management of groundwater? And would it, just for consideration, as we work through this, wouldn't it be much easier to set the goal in front that it is for management of groundwater as opposed to trying to develop these distinct goals for each and every area, 52 basins in the state. Just something to consider.
I guess I think my thought was is that the council and the local individuals would be establishing those goals for the LGSA area.
And if I may, that's where you start to get into the rub of who's going to be on the council and how that, because that can tip the scale of what that will be. And it may not be the existing users.
Sandy, I guess I'll just also add to what Bruce said, that we hear the exact opposite, that folks don't want a centralized organization to come in and dictate the goal for their areas. So hopefully we can come up with something in between, maybe something that keeps more people happy on both ends of that, or in the middle of those both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, at least put some boundaries around it.
Representative Griffin.
Yeah, what I've heard is that we have two options right now. We have the active management areas and irrigation non-expansion areas. But we do have a third that was passed in 2008, and the counties can adopt the adequate water supply plan. Only 2 counties have done that, Cochise and Yuma. If this is such an important issue, why haven't the other counties adopted the adequate water program?
So Representative Griffin, I don't know why more haven't, but that program is only about assured water supply, essentially home building. It's not a comprehensive management scheme of all the water uses as an AMA would be, or a little less comprehensive, but an INA goes beyond just home building as well. So it's less than comprehensive in terms of what an AMA and INA, or maybe LGSA or something similar, could possibly do.
And the local input not approved, looking at the HOAs, Homeowners Association, they actually have to be an owner of property. They actually elect their board. They actually vote on the plan. What we're talking about is none of the above. So it doesn't make it local.
Representative Griffin, are you suggesting a statewide groundwater HOA? Just kidding. You don't have to answer that question.
Property Owners Association, perhaps, huh?
Can we move to the slide with the different components of the LGSA starting point? Great. I just want to point out, we've had some great feedback from members of the council here today. We've heard items about what is and what isn't in the LGSA as a starting point for a rural groundwater management framework. We've heard different perspectives about centralized versus local input and decision-making in a rural groundwater management framework. Just in this meeting, differences of opinions. Points about the duration of this management framework, and I would point out here on the slide that there's a 10-year off-ramp that's being contemplated in this committee. So these are all different components of a new rural groundwater management framework option that I would hope the Rural Groundwater Committee could continue to have productive and spirited debates over all of these different components in the Rural Groundwater Committee meetings, which the next is on Thursday. So Nicole brought up a helpful reminder that at the last Rural Groundwater Committee, the department put together a slide deck of different elements of these different areas of what could be in a new groundwater management framework. And so maybe the department can again send out a reminder about that, as this is what we want folks to reference. Think about what do we like in here, what do we not like in here, and come prepared next Thursday to continue discussing those policy options. So I think we've started to get to some of those things today, and I hope we have another productive discussion about that next Thursday in the Rural Groundwater Committee.
Tom, this is Sharon Midgo. May I make
10-year off-ramp, you're only allowed to go off the ramp if you're not using groundwater for drinking water.
Grant.
Thank you. And thanks for those comments, Patrick. And Bruce, I appreciate your comments too about looking to the senator to represent those constituencies. I had a process question for that meeting on the 14th because I think there's a second opportunity for the committee members to submit comments, and Senator Kerr has gone to that constituency and intends to submit comments by the September 8th deadline. The last time comments were submitted and then we proceed with this LGSA proposal, are we thinking for the 14th that we will evaluate the comments submitted, or will we continue to charge forward on the LGSA front?
It's definitely evaluating the comments that are going to be submitted and then use the LGSA again as the framework. It may not be quote unquote an LGSA where we end up with. But we want to make sure that we meet the objectives that we're trying to meet when it comes to addressing these rural groundwater issues. Yes.
Yeah, I think, and just to clarify it, the September 8th deadline is just in order to be able to share the comments with the other members of the committee. It's not really a deadline. Obviously, everybody can make additional comments at the meeting itself, but we had agreed that any comments submitted by September 8th, we would share with other committee members so that they could be prepared to discuss those comments.
This is Sharon
Anyone
McDowell. May
else
I make
around
a
the table?
comment? Tom, may I make a comment?
I'll make another call to those online. Anyone online?
Hi, Sharon
we move on.
McDowell is trying to speak.
This
Members?
is Sharon McDowell.
And also Senator Sundaration, also hand up. We can't raise our hands online.
Hello?
Hello?
I am not.
Jamie Kelly
seeing
after
anyone
Senator.
online, so I think we'll.
Hear me?
They can't hear us, I guess.
I guess not, because I've been trying to.
Director
do something.
Bushatsky, can you hear us?
Are some folks
Director?
online having trouble unmuting?
No, you're not hearing us.
Oh, you
We
can't
each
hear
other.
us.
It's that you can't hear us.
The room is not getting us.
We have a bunch of people talking and not.
I'm just gonna keep waving my hand in case.
Yeah, I want to say something, and so somebody from here can manage it.
Did your raise the hand button go away?
Yes, I
Jamie
think
Kelly is
because
waving her
we're
hand, I hear.
co-hosts.
Jamie,
Yeah,
can
we're
you not?
co-hosts.
so. The hand goes away.
I'm getting on the part of it.
If you can't unmute, can you type it in the chat?
There's no chat.
There's no chat.
No chat? I guess
Okay.
you can't type it in the chat then.
Can you hear us though?
I don't think they can hear us.
I think we've had issues with chat hijacking seriously before, which is why I think we disabled the chat.
I mean, yeah, they
That's why I
could,
love in-person meetings.
maybe they've disconnected the video. Yeah.
Okay, so next time I make the trip.
I don't know, Jamie. That I'm not sure that's the solution.
It's not gonna work with my class schedule, so can't do.
So I don't know that we're going to solve our technical issues very quickly. I would ask those who are online who have questions or comments to either contact Trent or Carol, or you can submit them to either one in writing as well, and we'll try to address them. Sorry about that.
Unequal,
I
unfair.
don't like that. It worked before.
So if we could
so
go
what
to
happened?
upcoming meetings, Trent.
Remember, he had trouble with me, and I don't think it
So
was.
we talked about this a bit already. Short
They
water
gave
supply.
us co-host status.
September 12th, 10 to noon. Rural Groundwater Committee,
I wonder if
September
we
14th, 10 to
maybe
noon.
if I
Those are both
un-
committee meetings.
get off
And
of
then a
comments.
tentative date for the Governor's Water Policy Council next meeting, Friday, October 27th, from 1 to 3. We will have additional dates forthcoming, I think, to try to get this tight schedule through December. We can probably expect committees to meet at least once a month.
If I
moving
become the
forward.
presenter, I wonder if
Yesterday,
I
as we were prepping up, Staff share with me a very detailed Gantt
Hate to
chart.
interrupt him, but
Try
okay.
to keep up with all the work that we have to do to get prepped up for these meetings. And so I had the thought, as we were working through the fifth management plan, we had timelines with key dates to achieve the outcomes there, to get those plans adopted by the deadlines we needed there. And we're going to be creating a similar timeline to share with all of you. And we're not going to wait till the next council meeting to send that to you or to discuss that. When we have that prepared, we'll send it to all of you and post it on our website. So it'll be key points in time, key milestones that we have to meet to get to where the governor asked us to be in December. So now I can see you, Jamie. I don't know if you can hear me.
Can you hear us now? Can you hear me?
We still can't hear you, and now it flipped to Senator Sundaration.
Can you hear us? Can you hear me? Any of us? Jamie, you try.
And
I don't think he can
Senator,
hear
we're still
us.
not hearing you.
I got some messages to call Sharon. Maybe they're coordinating on the phone. Okay. The senator is nodding up and down,
Sure.
just relaying the message.
Chris put us on the phone.
Mr. Director, I'm now getting a call from the senator. She wants to speak through my phone.
Put it through your microphone if that might work.
Tricia.
Do you think this could work?
Let's try.
Okay.
Do you want to? I don't know if it's going to work. Try it now.
Okay, and then I won't hear anything until I'll hang up and after my comments are done. I just wanted to say I'm blown away by the data presentation. I think that we kind of went past it quickly. I think that it's really, important information that was shared with us. The data that was presented, including that there are a number of priority basins that have been identified in severe decline. I think that is really, really important information that we have now. And if there's even, I understand, we spent a lot of time going into the robustness of the data used to calculate and identify these basins where we have the indexed wells that have been the same wells collecting data over 20 years. But then with a caveat that where there is only one such well in certain areas that may be kind of less indicative of performance. And I was wondering if we could supplement those areas where there's only one such well that has been collecting data over 20 years with wells collecting data over a lesser period of time, but to still provide some kind of, if not as robust as the same wells over 20 years, but some level of additional data there. And just again, that's just a really important data that we saw showing the real decline in the aquifer level in some of these basins, and just underlining the importance of the work. Again, I'm on the Assured Water Supply Committee, so like Spencer, I feel like I'm missing out on what the Rural Groundwater Committee's been doing, but it feels, especially given the data that we just saw, very important work going on.
I will say too that there are more publications and there are more data out there. And if you go to the hydrology webpage on our website, there's a publications list, and that publications list has annually water level change maps for select basins based on which ones we did sweeps in. But there is more available than just this one data set. It's just, this is just a good one that we could look at across all basins and have a uniform set of criteria for what we were showing you guys. So you can definitely go into those basins that have 1 or 2 or 3 wells in that table. Go into the GWSI site and you can see all the wells that we have, and click on each one. You can see a hydrograph, so you can see the water level over time for any well that we've collected data from. So there's a copious amount of data available. It's just a matter of presenting it in a way that's quick and easy to take in. So that's the difference between what we showed and what's actually available. There's a lot more. Hence the first slide showing 1,700 and all of that was to kind of point to, hey, if you're curious about individual areas, go ahead and poke around.
If the floor opens up.
Aaron or Jamie, can you try to speak now and see if that'll work?
Can you hear me now?
Did you hear Jamie? This is Sharon now. Could you hear either of us?
Sharon, I'm on the phone.
Oh, you're on the phone. Okay, I'm not.
Can you hear me? You have to mute your computer.
Sharon, call Chris Kuzda later.
She's muted. Let's try this again.
There's still too much feedback.
Yep.
Yeah, move away from your own computer when you're on the phone. Or lower your speakers.
In Arizona, I encourage everybody to take a look at it and again, commend the department for the work that they have done so far. Thank you.
Thank you.
If they are, no one's waving at me. No, it's unmuted. That's my speaker.
Can I speak now? You're hearing me. This is really wild. Jokes. Oh, Chris said. Anyway, this is Cheryl. We can't bring her hands. We can't see her. But anyway, what I wanted to suggest was that in advance of next Thursday's meeting of the groundwater committee, we clarify our assignments and expectations. Because as I understood it, really focusing on the LGSA framework and particular not even the whole thing about council members. So I would just request that there be some modification and clarification to our assignment so that we're properly prepared for next. And I'll just give it.
Hi, Sharon, this is Bruce.
Our expectation now is to look at the, I believe it was the orientation and creation. And then council members, just those two areas. And if you look back at the presentation that we provided, you'll see some remarks and suggestions that we made associated with those two elements. So those are the key concepts primarily. We'll send down an email reminder.
All right, so can we go to the last slide? So I just want to say, apologize for the technical problems. Try to get this worked out for the committee meetings so we don't see this again. Appreciate everyone's participation today, all the comments. We've got some opportunities here. We obviously have some challenges here as well. To come up with some recommendations where we can have large support for these efforts. But I think certainly the information that Ryan talked about in terms of basin by basin, what the situation is telling for rural groundwater issues. And I think we all know the challenges we're facing with assured water supply. So again, thanks to everybody. We'll send out an email again, what our expectations are for the next both committee meetings, so folks who are going to participate can come as prepared as they can possibly be. And with that, I'm going to adjourn the meeting and thank you all.